North Atlantic Ocean, April 1943. The sea is black glass under a sickle moon. A German U-boat, hull number U-123, drifts between waves at periscope depth. Inside, condensation drips from steel plates onto men who have long forgotten the smell of fresh air. The engines are silent. Only the creak of hull and ticking of gauges break the stillness. Then, sound. A metallic pulse vibrates through the pressure hull. Ping, ping, ping. Each echo sharper, closer. The crew freeze, eyes darting to their captain. He lowers headphones onto his ears, then jerks backward. Through static, he hears something unbelievable. A human voice. English. Clear, mechanical, distorted by water, but unmistakable. Target acquired. Maintain depth. Prepare pattern B, over. The sound vanishes, swallowed by the ocean. A second later, the ship shudders. Depth charge concussions rolling down from the surface like thunder in stone corridors. As lights flicker and pipes burst, the captain realizes what it means. The Americans are talking through the sea, hundreds of miles away on an Allied destroyer escort. Technicians lean over a console labeled Underwater Telephone 1A. Seawater has become a battlefield of sound. Tonight, the invisible war of voices has begun. By the second winter of World War II, the North Atlantic had become humanity's most merciless battlefield. There were no front lines here, only convoys. Endless columns of merchant ships, each one filled with the supplies that kept Britain alive: food, rifles, oil, men. To cripple those arteries, Germany sent packs of hunters into the deep. The U-boats. The mathematics of destruction favored them. A single submarine, creeping unseen beneath the convoy, could sink 30,000 tons of shipping before anyone knew it was there.
In 1942 alone, they destroyed more than 700 Allied ships, a rate brutal enough for Churchill himself to admit.
The U-boat peril is the only thing that really frightens me. Destroyers and escorts fought back with spotlights, grenades, and primitive sonar, known in Britain as ASDIC, named after the Allied Submarine Detection Investigation Committee. It was revolutionary in theory but fragile in practice. Operators sent pulses of sound through the water and waited for the echo from a steel hull. Yet the system was narrow-minded. It worked only directly below, failed in rough seas, and collapsed when convoys clustered together. By 1942-43, the Germans knew its limits. They surfaced boldly at night, recharging batteries and striking with torpedoes before the escorts could respond. The ocean belonged to the hunters again. Then, quietly, everything changed. Across the Atlantic, in Washington and New London, a different kind of army worked in basements and laboratories. Scientists, engineers, and academics pulled from Bell Labs, Harvard, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. They were told to reinvent hearing itself. Their directive was deceptively simple: make the sea speak. The U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ships in 1941 had created a new test phrase: Submarine Signal Division, Underwater Sound Laboratory, headquartered at Fort Trumbull in Connecticut. Their physicists discovered that sound waves, not radio, were the fastest and most reliable medium underwater. Electricity died in salt water. Light vanished within meters, but acoustic energy traveled for miles. From those insights emerged two weapons: active sonar, to find, and the underwater telephone, to coordinate. Both ran on a common principle: transducers converting electric current into vibration and back again. When a destroyer emitted a ping, every molecule between ship and target carried that pulse outward. Echoes marked enemies. Modulated pulses carried speech. Britain shared its own research through the secret Tizard mission, handing America its early ASDIC schematics. The Americans multiplied its power through stronger amplifiers, directional hydrophones, and signal patterning that turned vague echoes into crisp distances. By late 1942, destroyers escorting convoys bore strange disc-shaped instruments welded to their hulls. Inside, young sailors learned to interpret mysterious sounds: returns, splashes, engine bearings, forming a new language of underwater warfare: bearing contacts, Doppler shifts, alpha echoes. Then came the experiment that would terrify the Germans, the UWT, an underwater telephone. Using frequencies around 8 to 12 kilohertz, ships could now talk to each other through the sea. Orders, coordinates, even brief status reports crackled over short distances. Submariners below could faintly hear the voices, but they could not answer or jam them. To U-boat crews already haunted by phantom pings, those human tones felt like proof of Allied omniscience. It was a victory of intellect, not numbers. While the Luftwaffe and the Wehrmacht relied on hardware, the Allied navies turned to physics. In 1943, as convoy HX-219 crossed the Atlantic, a hunter-killer escort group demonstrated the full strength of sound. Destroyers USS Bogue and USS Buckley coordinated attacks by voice through water, boxing in a German sub whose echoes danced between them. The Germans had no idea the automatic depth settings guiding the Americans were fed by real-time undersea communication. The U-boat vanished, never found again. What had begun as mere detection evolved into orchestration, an invisible choir of ships, pings and voices weaving through the depth. To the men below, it sounded like sorcery. To the engineers above, it was just the triumph of wave equations. But technology is never born into silence. It always arrives amid disaster. And the disaster that drove the United States to listen to the ocean had begun a year earlier, when the sea itself seemed to belong to Germany. By early 1942, the Atlantic was bleeding. On charts in Washington and London, bright red lines marked shipping losses stretching west toward the Americas. German U-boats called it their second happy time. Off the U.S. coast, cargo vessels still sailed lit at night, their running lights visible to submarine periscopes like beacons. In only 6 months, over 500,000 tons of American shipping had been sunk. The Atlantic was not just a battlefield. It was a graveyard, a doctrine born from World War I, the idea that ships could defend themselves with guns or luck, had failed utterly. Convoys could survive only if they could see without eyes, hear without light, and strike where the enemy swam unseen. The urgent phrase that echoed through Allied briefings was, "Sound is the key." In 1942, at Harvard University, Dr. Frederick Hunt and his underwater sound laboratory spearheaded a leap forward. The QHB sonar, far more sensitive than British ASDIC. Its rotating transducers, sleek metal domes lowering beneath destroyer keels, sent flaring echoes across 360 degrees. For the first time, operators could map motion instead of hearing isolated blips. Parallel to this, Bell Telephone Laboratories transformed communication theory into hardware, creating the first underwater telegraphy units, internally nicknamed talkback phones. These devices looked unremarkable, gray boxes with knobs and handset cradles, but what they achieved seemed impossible. 2 ships could maintain verbal contact through submerged speakers and microphones, up to 3 miles apart. When combined with radar and sonar data, hunter-killer groups could coordinate attacks, shift depth charge patterns, and even signal submarines trapped mid-depth to surrender. The physical science behind it was elegant. Sound waves travel in water roughly 4 times faster than in air, but with different absorption depending on temperature, salinity, and depth. Experiments off Cape Cod revealed sound channels, deep layers where acoustic energy could travel immense distances with almost no loss. The ocean, once mute, was found to contain natural corridors of communication. Engineers called it the SOFAR channel, short for sound fixing and ranging, discovered jointly by American and British teams. Messages could ride those corridors across hundreds of miles, whispering where radio could not. Later in the war, signal buoys deployed across the Atlantic would detect these messages, creating what the press never saw but the Navy quietly nicknamed the Talking Ocean. For Germany, this development was both invisible and incomprehensible. The Kriegsmarine's B-Dienst, its communications intelligence arm, excelled at cracking Enigma variants for surface fleets, but acoustics lay outside their arithmetic. Reports from captured U-boat logs around 1943 mention unexplained resonance from enemy ships, mechanical, vibration of artificial voice, and pings followed by spoken orders. Commanders assumed new propaganda, tactics, perhaps broadcast recordings, played through depth charges to demoralize crews. The truth was simpler and far more threatening. American ships were networked underwater. What unnerved the Germans most wasn't just detection. It was organization. A U-boat might evade a single pursuer, but not a choir of destroyers speaking through the sea itself. In May 1943, during convoy ONS-5, the battle historians mark as the turning point, The Allies combined radar, sonar, and underwater voice lines into a single offensive rhythm. When one escort lost contact, another took the handoff seamlessly. The Wolfpack died amid its own confusion. 30 U-boats attacked. 12 were sunk. For the first time, the hunter became prey. Behind those operational victories stood thousands of nameless analysts, chemists testing rubber insulators, mathematicians modeling reflection angles, radio operators adjusting gain knobs by feel. They built nothing glamorous: microphones encased in wax, waterproof cables sealed with tar. Yet each crude device turned the Atlantic's dark water into a predictive map. It was this invisible lattice, the sum of echo, vibration, and coordination, that German sailors later called the telephone of death. Each strike seemed to follow precisely from an echo they could not hide. By the end of 1943, Allied command decided that underwater communication was no longer experimental. It was doctrine. Every new destroyer escort left U.S. shipyards fitted with sonar and a UWT console as standard equipment. The tidal statistics of the war soon mirrored the change. That autumn, monthly shipping losses dropped by 2/3. U-boat kill ratios inverted for the first time since 1940. The roar of underwater detonations had become the background music of Allied progress. The ocean had learned to speak, and now it began to answer with voices, technologies, and tactics that would shape the rest of the campaign and the psychology of everyone trapped beneath those waves. The next part of the story explores those human and mechanical dimensions, the angles through which this silent network transformed fear, courage, and science into dominance. No other job in World War II combined science and terror quite like Sonar Watch. Operators sat in small, dim compartments, their faces inches from glowing dials, headphones pressed so tightly that half the crew carried permanent bruises behind their ears. The equipment flickered, the ship groaned, and through that electronic heartbeat came the ocean itself. Groans, creaks, vibrations. To the untrained ear, it was chaos. To the operator, it was language. Young men barely out of school learned to divide sound into categories: whale song, propeller cavitation, torpedo wake. They heard the difference between a freighter's slow churn and a U-boat diesel breathing in short bursts. Experienced listeners could even tell which German model was nearby, Type 7 or 9, by the rhythm of its engine cycle. That skill kept convoys alive, but for every moment of mastery there was one of horror. A metallic blur might mean nothing, or it might mean a torpedo closing fast. Underwater combat offered no warning flares or horizon lines, only the certainty that when contact came, it came instantaneously. Every ping could call death back to its source. Operators called it the sound boomerang. For U-boat crews, the human strain was worse. Prolonged depth charging changed body chemistry. Ears bled, inner pressure disoriented balance. Psychiatrists in post-war studies found that some German survivors still reacted to loud knocks as if the bulkheads might split. One veteran described the pings as the tapping of gods we couldn't see. Between these two groups, the listeners and the listened, stretched an invisible bond. Fear, shared through pressure waves that crossed miles of seawater. Each side heard the other breathing, and neither could look away. Until 1943, anti-submarine warfare resembled blind guessing. Escorts dashed toward a sonar echo, dropped depth charges, and prayed. The innovation of underwater telephony changed coordination entirely. Each destroyer escort carried a UQC unit, an underwater communication set linking ships at 3 to 5 nautical miles. Its advantage was silence to the sky. German signals intelligence could intercept radio, but not these submerged murmurs. In convoy operations codenamed Blackflower and later Neptune, escorts formed a moving triangle around merchant ships. When contact occurred, the first ping echoed through all hydrophones simultaneously. Commander to commander, voices traveled below the surface. Contact. Bearing 270, range 900 yards. Roger, maintain depth. Port unit closing. Through those phrases, the Atlantic battles acquired precision. Destroyers now attacked in choreography. The first ship held sonar contact, the second triangulated. The third dropped patterns of 6 or 9 charges at calculated depths. Hunters could switch seamlessly, ensuring the target never slipped between them. The U-boats had no equivalent. German commanders relied on coded radio bursts to their BDU headquarters, and those very transmissions exposed them to Allied direction finding. When American ships began talking through the sea itself, the asymmetry became decisive. Tactically, the new communication meant endurance. No longer did escorts break off to avoid collision or misreport targets. Their carrion pings crossed, merged, and sustained a continuous track long after a U-boat dove. In May 1943's ONS-5 battle, this networked pursuit annihilated an entire wolf pack. After Clarion-style acoustic cooperation proved itself, American naval doctrine formalized hunter-killer groups. The flagship's sonar section coordinated all subsurface communication, creating what was in essence an acoustic data link 3 years before the term existed. The results built confidence out of chaos. Where once captains hesitated to chase an echo, they now conversed mid-pursuit, confirming bearings through shared underwater speech. It was still guesswork, but shared guesswork, synchronized by vibration. Most histories of the Atlantic War are filled with tonnage graphs and convoy charts, but the true revolution lay hidden inside steel casings. The key to the American leap was the transducer. Early ASDIC units used quartz crystals, fragile and expensive. U.S. engineers replaced them with magnetostrictive nickel rods, cheaper and far tougher. When magnetized, these rods expanded and contracted, producing steady acoustic pulses that resisted depth pressure. The technology doubled operational ranges and, crucially, allowed voice transmission. The typical setup on a Buckley-class destroyer consisted of a dome transducer housed under the keel, attached to an amplifier rack feeding both sonar and the UQC phone. When not pinging, it could send modulated tones carrying speech frequencies. On quiet nights, an operator could literally say, "Testing 1-2" into the microphone and hear it return seconds later as a watery echo. It was eerie proof that sound had become a tangible tool. Every innovation met immediate field testing. Off Block Island and Bermuda, research ships recorded propagation studies with underwater microphones suspended at intervals of 10, 50, 100 meters, logging how temperature layers bent acoustic paths. Out of this data grew the foundations of peacetime oceanography. The simplicity of the system hid its genius. Single-band communication under specific kilohertz windows that avoided self-interference. Most transmissions were unintelligible at the source. They transformed entirely below the thermocline. Words smeared into vibrating syllables before reforming as recognizable speech on the receiving end. To civilians, it sounded like science fiction, and to German technicians, it defied plausibility. Declassified post-war reports reveal that in 1944, U-boat intelligence units doubted such a device could work. The salt content of the Atlantic, they argued, would distort any signal. They never learned that distortion was precisely what Allied engineers exploited, bending sound the way radar bent radio. From these machines came modern sonar vocabulary, pings, sweeps, Doppler. To those who built them, they weren't instruments of war but extensions of hearing, earbones crafted of steel, learning to listen at 10,000 atmospheres. Below and above the waves, men and their inventions were merging into the same organism, machines that heard, sailors who spoke through the sea, enemies who learned that fantasy could become physics overnight. The next angles reveal what that merging meant for those on the receiving end. German crews trapped beneath a speaking ocean, scientists who turned laboratories into lifelines, and the moral threshold crossed, when sound itself became a weapon. The first reports arrived in spring 1943, patrol logs from U-boat flotillas out of I. Lorient and Saint Nazaire described auditory phenomena that defied training manuals. Captains wrote about artificial echoes that seemed to multiply, phantom submarines circling them in impossible numbers. Others described hearing faint metallic murmurs, sometimes rhythmic, sometimes distinctly human. One commander insisted he caught the words, "Hold course, depth 150. His crew mocked him until the sea answered with sharp concussions. He survived. His U-boat didn't. For seasoned veterans used to mastering fear through rational process, these experiences undermined authority itself. The Atlantic had been a place of predictable danger, torpedoes, aircraft, rough weather. But now the sea itself seemed to betray them, echoing human intention where only nature should exist. Psychologists later called it acoustic disorientation. Without visual cues, the mind overinterprets every sound. P-47s howled in sky, Destroyers sang beneath. The Germans began calling the phenomenon the chorus of the abyss. Some tried to jam the pings by revving engines or releasing decoys, but nothing fooled the coordinated triangle of Allied voices. Inside U-boats, life shrank to sonic confinement. Passive listeners held their breath, counting seconds between depth charges while the captain measured the growing terror in men's eyes whenever that electronic heartbeat began again. Ping. Ping, ping. By 1944, superstition bled into operational reality. Crews swapped rumors that Allied ships could converse with whales, that voices came from spirits of drowned sailors, that the sea had turned American. The more sophisticated among them didn't need mythology. They knew scientifically that the Allies had built something beyond countermeasure. They just didn't know what. After the war, captured officers touring American laboratories finally saw those devices: compact microphones, amplifiers glowing under test tubes of seawater. Several reportedly refused to believe such small machines had undone their Navy, but their own casualty list told the truth. Germany had lost its acoustic war before it even understood the rules. While U-boat crews fought their invisible tormentors, a network of laboratories across America and Britain fought the war in equations. Their world smelled of solder flux and salt crust, not powder or diesel. At the Harvard Underwater Sound Laboratory, Frederick Hunt's team measured the branching of sound through varying salinity, using enormous glass tanks. At Bell Telephone Laboratories, Dr. Harold Black and his engineers perfected amplifiers rugged enough to survive ship vibration. Westinghouse and General Electric produced hydrophones by the hundreds, encased in rubber to withstand crushing depths. At the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C., physicists like Harvey Hayes and Maurice Ewing drafted charts of the Atlantic's thermal layers, the unseen walls and corridors that trapped sound. They discovered that under certain pressure and temperature combinations, acoustic waves curved toward a fixed depth, traveling thousands of miles with minimal loss. This discovery, the SOFAR channel, would outlive the war itself. Every scientific memo carried moral undertones. The same equations that enabled communication could also guide depth-charge fuses or torpedo detonators. Scientists knew their formulas equated directly to men's lives. Some rationalized. Every convoy saved justified a discovery. Others, notably Ewing, saw in those echoes something larger, the first comprehensive understanding of the ocean's voice. The collaboration was unprecedented. Civilians received naval ranks overnight. Laboratories worked 24 hours a day, and academic rivalries dissolved beneath patriotic urgency. At MIT, professors who once lectured on resonance now spent nights testing soundproofing for ship compartments. Bell's engineers, used to telephone cables, adapted their waterproof jackets for undersea microphones. War forced knowledge downward, literally, to the sea floor. Their legacy was more than victory. At war's end, these same researchers pivoted seamlessly into pure oceanography. What began as anti-submarine acoustics became marine science. Within 5 years, naval technology birthed the geological mapping of trenches and continental shelves, the hidden landscapes, whose first outline came from sonar pings meant to kill. Every technological revolution in war opens an ethical wound, and underwater communication carved one wider than most. Combat had always required a sort of witness, the sight of an enemy through periscope or gunsight. The Echo War removed that witness entirely. A sonar operator fired at coordinates generated by sound, not vision. The men destroyed often died without ever being seen. Their ships became abstract geometry on a screen. Allied commanders justified it by efficiency. Each U-boat sunk meant hundreds of merchant sailors safe. Yet some operators confessed unease. Wartime diaries from sonar rooms describe a chilling intimacy. "We heard them die through the headphones," one petty officer wrote. "First the propeller beat stops, then the hull crushes, like a sigh through gravel." For the Americans on escort ships, each depth charge was followed by silence, then bubbles rattling against hull plates, a kind of applause from physics itself. And within that mechanical triumph lurked pity. Sound had carried human voices, and sound now carried their end. Germany endured the same disconnect. Sailors died without combat, suffocating unseen, hearing only machine voices counting their final depth. The survivors later described the Allied pings as mercilessly polite, methodical, distant, almost courteous. The enemy's voice spoke in perfect cadence while pressing a button that collapsed steel. War rarely allows reflection amid survival, but those who fought it later recognized what had happened. Humanity had turned hearing into both messenger and executioner. It wasn't hatred that filled the ocean. It was mathematics. When peace finally came, the silence felt heavier than noise. Ships still carried sonar, but their crews listened differently, to safety signals, to whales, to research buoys. The habit of listening remained. Only the purpose changed. The Atlantic had become fluent, and the men who gave it language would soon test that fluency on an even greater scale, the moment the ocean's new voice guided its most decisive battle of all. The next part will recount that turning point. The winter operations of 1943-44, when the Allies' talking ocean transformed from technology to supremacy and ended Germany's rule beneath the waves. Winter 1943 Atlantic. Winds howled across convoys moving in rigid marching order. 5 columns of ships under dim navigation lamps, the sky stitched with snow and ice crystals. On escorting destroyers, sound operators monitored their headphones with ritual precision, fingers resting on gain knobs. The convoy code name was ONS-5. 42 merchant vessels escorted by 8 Allied warships, crawling west toward Newfoundland under constant shadow from at least 30 German U-boats. For both sides, this convoy would mark the hinge of the Battle of the Atlantic. At 22:30 hours on April 29th, a sharp, metallic echo skittered across the main sonar screen of HMS Duncan. "Contact bearing 270 degrees, the operator called. Within seconds, the signal transferred through underwater telephone to another destroyer. "This is Duncan. Contact confirmed." Across 4,000 yards of frigid water, those words arrived as a tremor of human vibration, received through hydrophones of USS Pink. For German Commander Wilhelm Zahn aboard U-264, the sudden increase in pinging meant discovery. He ordered a crash dive, but before his boat reached safe depth, detonations rolled overhead. Not accurate yet, only probing. Instead of fleeing, the escorts triangulated again, calling through water. "Mark red. Submerge at 150 feet. Prepare pattern 3. 5 destroyers converged like points of a compass. For 9 minutes, Zahn's crew believed escape likely. Then the sea began to detonate in rhythms. Charges fell in perfect intervals, thunderclaps so evenly spaced that veterans likened it to a church bell tolling underwater. Between concussions, the crew heard something new, faint, channeled voices. Zahn screamed at his men to silence machinery. They did, and still the whispers came. Orders, bearings, American vowels turned liquid by depth. The sound arrived everywhere at once, as if the water itself had joined the hunt. By 02:00 a.m., U-264 broke the surface, its hull bleeding compressive fractures. Dazed men scrambled to surrender as searchlights sliced the snow. Lookouts on HMS Duncan leaned over their railings, watching German sailors cling to wreckage glowing in phosphorescent wake. They had not fired guns. They had listened, spoken, and depth-charged by conversation. That battle proved more than a single victory. Out of 30 U-boats docking ONS-5, 12 were destroyed. Winston Churchill, reviewing signals later, called it the climacteric of our Atlantic battle. The weapon that won it was not steel, but synchronization, a fleet speaking through liquid air. From that night, every convoy carried new confidence. Communications drills replaced firefighting practice. Sonar phones became as indispensable as radar scopes. In Boston shipyards, welders cut openings for additional hydrophone domes. What had begun as experimental boxes now defined survival doctrine. By the year's end, Allied shipping losses dropped to their lowest since 1939. German Admiral Dönitz ordered recall of the greatest portion of his fleet for reassessment. His analysts blamed Allied aircraft, radar, and escort carriers, all accurate, but failed to grasp the cohesive power of underwater communication. The Americans had turned the ocean into a shared nervous system. One moment captured the transformation. In November 43, the escort carrier USS Bogue Group, Task Group 21.12, struck deep into mid-Atlantic. P dimensions were unfavorable, radar unreliable in fog, yet 3 destroyers linked by underwater telephones hunted U-172 for 31 hours without break, alternately holding contact and exchanging positions by sonic speech while taking on supplies mid-pursuit. On the evening of November 13th, U-172 was forced to surface, blackened, her crew collapsing from exhaustion. The coordination on record remains textbook. Voice link sustained throughout entire action. To the German survivors picked up afterward, the capture felt unreal. It was as if they were everywhere, one engineer said. None realized they'd been fighting a single conversation weaving through salt water and static. The immediate outcome was strategic dominance, but the longer one was psychological. Allied crews learned trust in sound, trust that an unseen ally heard exactly what they did. Fear, once amplified by isolation, was inverted into communication. In the confined, trembling rooms of sonar huts, men finally felt they weren't alone in the dark. And on the other side, that same echo meant doom. German patrols began calling each cluster of pings a death chorus. Training schools rewrote manuals. If multiple sonic sources detected on equal bearing, dive deeper but expect loss of contact. Position compromised. The advice rarely worked. The ocean no longer offered hiding places. With every convoy that arrived intact, morale at sea shifted irreversibly. Britain's lifeline, once stretched to breaking, tightened into resilience. The Allies now had a formula: radar above, sonar beneath, and the new underwater telephone bridging all in between. The climax of hearing had arrived. But the resonance of sound would carry into the next year, when German crews discovered how deeply the Americans had listened and how coordinated their communication web had become. That revelation, born in captured logbooks and dismantled wrecks, would finish breaking the back of the Kriegsmarine's faith in invisibility. By the opening of 1944, the details of what had happened in the Atlantic began filtering through captured correspondence. For the first time in the war, German sailors admitted that they did not understand how they were being found. Logs from U-boats scuttled off the Bay of Biscay contained frantic notations. Voices through hull, echoes from 4 directions. Enemy predicts bearing before surfacing. In Berlin, Admiral Karl Dönitz pored over a stack of such reports. The once methodical equations of submarine warfare, depth, stealth, patience, no longer worked. Even technical explanations offered little comfort. Naval engineers argued that enhanced Allied sonar might create illusions of speech, that stress and pressure hallucinations could account for crew reports. Yet every sinking proved that whatever the Allies were doing, it worked with terrifying accuracy. Back at sea, the phenomenon spread faster than verification. Crews departing from Saint-Nazaire whispered that ships could now talk underwater. They joked nervously that the Americans had trained the sea to betray the Reich. Every engine vibration aroused suspicion. Even routine noises, a loose bolt, a cough inside the pressure hull, seemed a potential beacon. Each man became hyper-aware that the ocean might repeat his heartbeat to the enemy. Meanwhile, on the Allied side, coordination turned systematic. On every escort vessel, navigation rooms now carried laminated checklists for the UQC-1A, the underwater telephone model fitted in 1944. Operation groups practiced disc record exercises. 2 vessels submerged microphones 30 feet apart, transmitting coded tones until they learned to synchronize by rhythm alone. What looked like simple communication was, in fact, the first coherent undersea network. This lattice of human voices and acoustic signals stretched invisibly across the convoy lanes. Hydrophones textbooked at 400-foot depth caught order pulses, translating them into vibrations that other ships could interpret. Within seconds, surface commanders could relay 3-dimensional coordinates to destroyers still churning miles away. The ocean, once the fortress of isolation, had become a shared message board. For the U-boat arm, 1944 was catastrophe disguised as persistence. Every sortie reduced fuel stores beyond recovery. Of the 119 boats dispatched in January, more than 30 were lost before March. The survivors stumbled north toward Norway, hoping to evade Allied tracking within Arctic conditions. Then came Operation Teardrop in spring 1945, the final demonstration of the talking sea. Allied intelligence, fearing missile-launching U-boats bound for America, deployed entire hunter-killer groups fitted with advanced sonar and underwater voice nets stretching from Canada to the Azores. Ships operated in absolute radio silence, conversing exclusively by acoustic link. On April 14th, The destroyer USS Frost and its consorts detected an echo southwest of Newfoundland. The contact U-880 dove at once. Every Allied ship shifted depth charge range in chorus, guided through the underwater network. Coordination so tight that one Navy reviewer later remarked, "It was as though one mind ran 8 ships." Within minutes, U-880 was crippled, forced up, her commander shouting surrender even as bubbles rose through a boiling surface. Captured sailors described the horror of it all. "We heard them speaking while we died," one petty officer later told interrogators. Voices of men far away counting depths with precision. "We could not block them, only listen." Within weeks, the final submarine flotillas were annihilated. May 1945 found the Atlantic still bristling with Allied escorts, but the Kriegsmarine no longer had ships left to challenge them. Donitz's communications to frontline boats grew absurdly short. "Save fuel. Evade only. Surface when ordered." He issued his stand-down on May 4th. By May 8th, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Post-war investigators at Flensburg examined captured Allied devices. On discovering the underwater telephone, German scientists recorded astonishment in lab diaries. Simple, ingenious, devastating. What they had imagined as mystical was merely rigorous physics applied with relentless discipline. Several even honored the triumph grudgingly. One engineer wrote, "In the future, the sea will belong to those who can command its voice." In Washington and London, the victory was considered a scientific watershed. The Atlantic didn't simply host a battle. It had conducted an experiment in acoustics on a planetary scale. For the first time, the navies of the world understood that oceans could be mapped by sound. The broader significance went beyond war. Those same technicians, freed from secrecy, began translating wartime sonar into peaceful research. The chain of microphones once used to hunt submarines soon traced undersea ridges and seamounts, eventually leading to the discovery of mid-ocean rifts that confirmed the theory of continental drift. Yet among veterans, the ghosts of that technology lingered. Former sonar men spoke of hearing phantom contacts in civilian life, imagined pings when passing rivers or harbors. German prisoners shipped home claimed they dreamt of metallic voices still echoing through dark water, calling bearings that no one answered. The underwater telephone had been born from necessity and crowned by tragedy, a human triumph written in static. By war's end, everyone who fought beneath the waves agreed on one truth whispered in many languages: the ocean was never silent again. Its reverberations, both scientific and moral, formed the immediate aftermath, a period when secrecy dissolved into progress, and the tools built for pursuit of war became the instruments of a listening world. The surrender was signed, but the Atlantic did not instantly quieten. For weeks after May 1945, Allied ships continued routine patrols, pinging the depths out of habit. The sea, once a predator's hiding place, now felt strangely vacant. Sonar operators accustomed to hearing the metallic rhythm of engines found only empty static. Many said it felt like listening for a heartbeat that had stopped. When Germany capitulated, 785 of its U-boats had been destroyed. 200 surrendered at port. Another 150 were scuttled by their crews rather than face the humiliation of capture. Those men understood that defeat had not come from any single weapon, but from an environment altered against them. The Allies had weaponized the ocean itself. In the following months, American and British intelligence teams descended on captured bases at Kiel, Bremen, and Lorient. They cataloged mountains of documentation, torpedo guidance systems, periscope optics, and sound decoy designs. Yet what drew the most curiosity were the small notebooks kept by U-boat captains, pages filled with meticulous sonar sketches, notes on unidentified Allied devices, and margins describing voices in the water. To the scientists who found them, those lines confirmed just how deeply the acoustic war had scarred imagination. At the same time, Allied engineers, freed from the urgency of combat, began dissecting their own inventions. The once classified UQC-1A underwater telephone became the subject of open conferences. Admiral Jonas H. Ingram told journalists that the victory in the Atlantic had been a war of mathematics and microphones. Newspapers simplified the explanation, coining phrases like America's talking ships and the fleet that hunted by echo. The true sophistication, precise modulation through salt water, Ionization effects, pressure layering, remained beyond public comprehension. Inside universities, scientists returned to peacetime questions with wartime momentum. At Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, former Navy physicists repurposed their hydrophones to study marine life. The same pings that once marked steel hulls now recorded whale migration and temperature gradients. Scripps Institution on the Pacific Coast built experimental listening lines across harbors to map underwater geography. Each trace of war technology became an artery of new research. For the United States Navy, the legacy transformed defense policy. The Office of Naval Research, founded in 1946, brought civilian laboratories permanently into military partnership. Its first memorandum drew directly from wartime success. Control of the sea requires control of its acoustics. Across the world, the Soviet Union observed carefully. Within 2 years, captured fragments of German research combined with leaked Allied reports to spark its own acoustic program. The secret race to command underwater sound would define the coming Cold War and the birth of continuous ocean monitoring networks. For the sailors who had fought the actual battles, these scientific revolutions carried little solace. On both sides, veterans wrestled with invisible memories. American soundmen spoke of sonar fatigue, the ghost hum that never stopped after months in the headphones. German survivors carried another kind of noise, recurring dreams of the final pings before their submarines broke apart. Nurses at post-war naval hospitals recorded entire wards of former U-boat men who could not sleep without hearing echoes through walls. Yet many of those same men adapted their skills to peace. Some joined the rebuilding of Germany's merchant marine. A handful even worked on Allied underwater cable projects, stringing telephone lines across the same seabed where they had once hidden. Paradoxically, the technology that exposed them now employed them. By 1947, the Atlantic lanes were alive again, no longer with sonar, but with commerce. The same hydrographic maps drafted from wartime data guided new routes for shipping, the beginnings of transoceanic telegraph cables, and eventually, the first transatlantic telephone wire. Each humming circuit traced its ancestry back to those wartime frequencies that once carried whispered coordinates of death. The sound of the future was born exactly where war had tried to make silence. But victory carries responsibility, and as the post-war years unfolded, the acoustic genius that saved convoys evolved into something grander and darker. The Allies would soon adapt the lessons of the talking ocean into a global system of surveillance that encircled the planet's seas. That transformation, how underwater telephony evolved into the permanent ears of the Cold War, is the final chapter of this story. When peace came, the Allies dismantled their wartime secrecy piece by piece, converting ingenuity into infrastructure. In 1948, engineers from the U.S. Navy and Bell Labs met again, this time not in wartime labs but in newly built listening stations along the coasts of Newfoundland, the Azores, and Greenland. The war had proven that sound could travel across oceans. Now they would make that permanence official. Under the quiet designation Project Michael and later Project Jezebel, America began wiring the seabed with long hydrophone arrays. Cables stretched for miles, each studded with ceramic microphones derived from the same magnetostrictive technology that once rang through convoy battles. The result, unveiled a decade later as SOSUS, the sound surveillance system, was the direct descendant of the underwater telephone. Where once the objective had been to safeguard shipping, the new goal was monitoring Soviet submarines carrying ballistic missiles. The ocean had become an acoustic map of the Cold War. British scientists joined with counterparts from Canada and Norway, forming the North Atlantic Hydrophone League. Their combined expertise shaped how future navies would operate. No commander now imagined a fleet without an invisible communication web beneath it. Orders, relays, even navigation cues flowed constantly under the waves in digital descendants of those wartime modulated pings. In Germany, the few scientists who survived the collapse found themselves courted by both sides. Physicists trained in acoustics were recruited through Operation Paperclip, quietly transported to U.S. universities and naval yards. In the Soviet bloc, counterparts built their own experimental sound corridors in the Black Sea and Arctic passages. The invisible duel resumed, this time beneath an ocean kept meticulously charted by science. For the broader world, those developments birthed an unexpected gift: Oceanographers now possess the most detailed sonic data collection ever compiled. Every hydrophone listening for submarines also listened passively to whales, earthquakes, and undersea volcanoes. The once classified SOFAR channel turned into a global scientific tool. Through it, researchers detected underwater nuclear tests, measured climate patterns, and mapped trenches thousands of meters deep. The post-war ocean, wired for war, became the planet's stethoscope. Culturally, the myth of voices in the water persisted. In documentaries and naval folklore, German veterans spoke of hearing the Americans talking through the sea, a supernatural ability that no discipline could explain. Decades later, declassified archives confirmed they hadn't imagined it. They had eavesdropped on history in real time, listening to the birth of modern communication through their own destruction. By the 1950s, sonar operators on both NATO and Warsaw Pact vessels shared a peculiar fraternity, a lineage of listeners. They spoke almost the same language: range, bearing, Doppler, contact strength. Former enemies mirrored each other's discipline, bound by equations that cared nothing for ideology. Expressions of regret occasionally broke through the technical jargon. In a 1959 interview, Dr. Harvey Hayes of the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory said quietly, "We won the sound battle, and now the world will never have silence again." He wasn't romanticizing. Every refitted destroyer, every survey ship carried sonar equipment. Ports vibrated faintly with low-frequency hums. Whales began altering migration paths to avoid noise. The ocean's new language spoke constantly, indifferent to its origin story. In the decades that followed, veterans visited memorials along coastal Europe. Some stood before preserved U-boats displayed in harbors like Wilhelmshaven and Bordeaux, listening to museum recordings of sonar pings piped through speakers for visitors. To them, it wasn't nostalgia, it was recognition. The same tones that once meant death now served education. Many credited that technological leap with more than victory. It introduced the concept that mastery of information, not just weapons, defined modern power. In the Atlantic campaigns, that information had traveled as sound. Later, it would travel as data, satellites, fiber optic cables, extensions of the same impulse: connect, detect, control. The underwater telephone was the primitive ancestor of the networked age. By the end of the 20th century, fragments of those first devices lay in museum drawers: nickel rods, bakelite headsets, dials worn smooth by salt. Few visitors recognized them. Yet every modern sonar ping and every deep ocean communication line still owes them its pulse. In those small relics rests the paradox of the 20th century, that the path to understanding the planet's last mystery, the ocean, was paved by a war that almost drowned it in noise. From the ruins of that silence grew a listening world, one that still hums with the memory of men who once used sound to find, to speak, and to survive. The next and final reflection will look beyond technology, toward the meaning hidden in the echoes, what it cost, and what it taught humankind about power, perception, and the limits of control. The story of underwater telephones is not just a chronicle of machines. It is the moment when two worlds, man and ocean, conversed for the first time. In that conversation, every human instinct appeared at once: fear, curiosity, the hunger to understand, and the urge to control. During the war, the ability to send a voice through salt water felt almost supernatural. To the men in the cramped hulls of U-boats, it sounded like prophecy, a reminder that even in the remotest dark, you are never unseen, never unheard. To the Allied sailors above, those same vibrations meant rescue and reassurance, a promise that somewhere beyond the storm, another voice would answer. When the guns fell silent, the technology endured. It became sonar, science, surveillance. It became a new way to comprehend a planet largely invisible to eyes. Every later triumph in oceanography, every charted trench, every rescued submersible, every recorded whale song, whispered its ancestry in those wartime pings. Humanity's will to listen had outlasted its will to destroy, and yet listening reshaped the listener. The ocean was no longer mystery. It was data. Beneath the scientific clarity lived a melancholy truth. The instruments that once hunted silence now guaranteed its extinction. From that day forward, the sea could never be mute again. Perhaps that is the final legacy of the underwater telephone. It began as a weapon, evolved into understanding and ended as an echo that defines our relationship with technology itself. A reminder that once we teach nature to speak, we inherit the responsibility of hearing everything it says. In the calm after war, sailors on both sides returning home described the same farewell moment. Standing on the decks of quiet ships, they removed their headphones and realized for the first time in years that the ocean beneath them was truly silent. It was the purest sound they had ever heard, and the one they would miss for the rest of their lives. The war that taught sound to kill had also taught it to connect. The voices that once whispered coordinates of destruction now continue as our enduring dialogue with the deep. The Atlantic still breathes with that memory, a vast cathedral of echoes, carrying the faint pulse of human invention through all the waters of the world.